Institute for the Study of Journalism, Global Journalism seminar series. I hope you all got some sleep after sitting up all night watching the US elections. I'm really, really pleased to welcome back Luke Harding. He was a journalist fellow, which is obviously his biggest, I get into trouble every time I try and introduce Luke. He was a journalist fellow at the Reuters Institute, but he's also an incredibly experienced journalist who's been at The Guardian for several years, worked on some of the biggest stories, including the coverage of WikiLeaks and the Panama Papers. He's the author of several books, including Collusion and Shadow State, which came out this summer, talking about Russian influence in Western politics. And crucially, he's one of the most brilliant thinkers of journalism, about what it means to be an investigative journalist, what it means to work in collaborative journalism, and what it means to frame stories in ways that work for international audiences as well as domestic audiences. We're really pleased to have him with us today. The format is as it ever was. Luke will speak for about half an hour and then we'll take questions. If you have questions, please type them into the chat function. Every time I chair Luke, it always seems slightly apocalyptic. And I remember, Luke, last time you spoke in person in Oxford was in March 2018, which was a Friday night seminar at Nuffield College, where it snowed and the university shut down. So every other talk and seminar across the university was cancelled because speakers couldn't get to Oxford. You made it, you battled through the snow, and therefore the turnout was so huge that we had to kind of move to the lecture theatre with all these kind of elderly professors slipping their way through the ice to listen to you. I remember that very well.
Maria, can you keep talking? My boss is on the phone. Hi, Jamie. Oh, he's gone. That was the foreign editor of The Guardian, probably wanting me to do something. So what do we want to do? I can call him back. Can you just talk for 2 more minutes?
Yes, absolutely. I can talk back for 2 more minutes, or I can. Can
you talk for 2 minutes while I've got him back?
Absolutely. So, so the reason I've asked Luke to speak today is because the concept of misinformation, disinformation, and interference in foreign elections is absolutely topical. And it's very, very important here that we both take the issue seriously, but also don't reach for easy platitudes, and crucially, don't take away the agency of populations and citizens to know and understand what they're voting for. It's simply not accurate and not fair and frankly patronizing to say that people are voting for certain politicians because they're being told to by someone on Twitter, by a bot on Twitter. And at the same time, it's completely misleading to say that the way information is flowing across social media has no bearing on the way political action is taken in this country. So with that, over to you, Luke.
Hello, everybody. I'm really sorry. There's the one person I couldn't ignore, who's Jamie Wilson. He's the foreign editor of The Guardian, and I'm kind of on sort of Biden, Trump kind of standby.
Thank you so much for talking to us today.
He's going to task me to do something. So if he rings again, I'll take the call and then I'll kind of keep going. So if you can kind of jump in. But I mean, I can do the seminar. So apologies for that, everybody. Just to say, it's been a kind of completely thrilling night. I mean, I stayed up until about 2, saw Florida was lost, went to bed, got up, it looked hopeless, but the latest, it seems to be the kind of upside down version of 2016, is it looks as if Joe Biden's going to win, not by much, but it seems he's going to do enough in the Midwest in what's been a kind of extraordinary election. I mean, it's really an incredible contest. I mean, I think, assuming he does win, which is where things have been flowing in the last sort of 90 minutes, 2 hours. 3 points on this before I kind of talk about other stuff. One is that I think it's pretty clear that Trump is a homegrown monster. I mean, the kind of repudiation that we thought might happen of Trumpism didn't happen. And the idea or the myth or the pleasant fantasy that Trump was an aberration, a freak result in 2016, has unraveled. It's clear that the country is riven and he has support from half of the population, and that he's actually built support to some extent, even if he loses, which I think he probably will at this stage. The next thing to say is that none of that kind of negates what I've been writing and investigating over the past decade or so, or the 2 books that I've done, which Mira mentioned, Collusion and Shadow State. I never suggested that Russia or the Kremlin are sort of, universal determiners, if you like, that Putin bestrides the world and or let's say sort of sits in a cave with red flashing buttons, making things happen from Washington to Oxford to London to Paris to Berlin or whatever. He isn't. He's not an omniscient supervillain, but he is an opportunist who takes advantage of the weaknesses and the divisions of Western societies, our societies, which have been absolutely manifest in recent years, and tries to exploit and instrumentalize them for his own purposes. And he seems to have sat out 2020 in the US. I think to some large degree, it was mission accomplished in 2016. And what we have to understand last time around, in a very narrowly fought election, the Kremlin role was much bigger. There was, I wrote about in Collusion, I revisited in Shadow State, there was a sort of multi-level espionage campaign featuring hackers working for Russian military intelligence and the FSB, featuring fake Americans who were fake American social media accounts being run out of St. Petersburg and the troll factory there, which I write about in Shadow State, and featuring kind of conventional espionage done through oligarch intermediaries and others. And in a very close scenario last time around, I think certainly Hillary Clinton thinks this. I think Russian assistance for Trump may have made all of the difference, but that is not to say that ultimately it's domestic factors which drove that election and are driving this election. The next thing I wanted to say was just about the global international situation, which I think is now very much to Russia's advantage, because the dynamic or the possible dynamic we'll see is that the Senate will stay Republican, the Supreme Court tilts heavily Republican 6-3, and if Biden gets across the line, the problem that he'll face is that he'll be obstructed at every turn, and it's going to be very hard for him to do meaningful reform. And the corollary of all that is that America is going to be kind of engulfed with its own problems. This civil war, cold civil war, quasi-civil war, conflict, division, whatever we want to call it, will continue. Will continue, and the focus of America, the sort of American vector, will be inward rather than outward, and that plays to the advantage of Russia and to other kind of malign or revisionist actors out there. And it means there'll be, even if Trump goes, there'll be a continuation of that gap, because Biden will be beset by difficulties, by civic unrest, especially if Trump loses. And it's going to be fraught, not just in the short term, but in the medium term. So that means that Russia can concentrate on what it's been doing all along, which is to project power, to try and influence events, politicians all over the place. I mean, I have a chapter in Shadow State about Africa, where political election observers have been going in recent years, except they're not really. They're essentially kind of Russian operatives working for Yevgeny Prigozhin, and making a kind of node, military, political, logistical in places like Sudan, in the Central African Republic, sending advisors to Madagascar, and so on. And in the great game of geopolitics, these things they're not hugely significant, but the point is it's Russia taking advantage of American retreat and disarray, and self-conflict, if that makes sense. So I think Putin will be watching events unfold in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, in Washington in the coming days, with no small sense of satisfaction. And just the last kind of macro point I wanted to make is that, I mean, it's hard to feel positive this morning. I mean, the blue tsunami didn't happen. The blue wave didn't quite happen. If it does work, it'll be a kind of blue pool, or modest sort of swimming pool. It's not an ocean, but this is good for journalism. I mean, we this morning, I beamed into the Guardian morning conference, and we, by 10 a.m. this morning, we had 70 million visitors to theguardian.com. I think that's the biggest day in our history. I mean, it wasn't at 10 a.m., but it will be by the end of the day. It'll be the most traffic ever since 1824, when the Guardian was founded. So there is enormous appetite for good, serious, responsible, balanced journalism. That's a great positive. And also, with Trumpism still very much there, there's going to be plenty of corruption to investigate. I mean, we still don't have a definitive readout of what happened in 2016. Maybe we'll find out more. But really, I think journalism in recent years has been sort of filling the civic gap where conventional politics should be, where other people should be, and actually it's been down to us to try and sort of shine light on all this. And I try and do it. My colleague Carol Cadwallader tries to do it, and plenty of investigative journalists in on the seminar try to do it as well. So I think we shouldn't despair. I think there's an awful lot for us to do. So those are my kind of big macro takeaways, and I'll just talk for a little bit, briefly about my sort of journalism career. I mean, Mira talked about that somewhat. I've done Oxford several times in happier pre-coronavirus epochs. I was at University College as an undergraduate reading English in the late 1980s, and met several leading members of the current government who are a couple of years ahead of me, or indeed had just left. Boris Johnson was a kind of slightly weird legend at that point. He'd just gone down from Oxford, and thought that these people were slightly ridiculous because they were socially very privileged. They were not as bright as they thought they were. They were extreme Thatcherites, for those of you who remember Margaret Thatcher. And I thought that they would not make it to power. And really the last few years have proved me wrong, big time. So I came back to Oxford, to the Reuters Institute in 2006. And I was also, I spent a year as a Guardian Research Fellow at Nuffield College. So I've now Oxford well. I've also got a kid at Queen's reading Japanese who, as of today, is still there, but God knows where he or indeed any of you will be by tomorrow. But for now, while Oxford is open, he is there. So big kind of connection with Oxford. And just on the Reuters program, I mean, for me, when I look at it, it was a halcyon moment. It was there's a wonderful word in English, prelapsarian, before the fall. And for me, Reuters in autumn 2006 was prelapsarian because in January 2007, I moved to Moscow with my wife, Phoebe, and our two then small children who'd been kind of, visiting the old seminar room and were in school for a term. And we sort of found ourselves pretty quickly plunged into what you might call a really badly written spy thriller, sub John le Carré with weird guys in black leather jackets, cheap black leather jackets and brown shoes following me around the icy streets of Moscow, and a series of break-ins at our apartment, which I wrote about in my first brusher book called Mafia State, and surveillance, which was made manifest in various ways. Sometimes it was obvious. You pick up the phone, you dial a foreign desk in London, and you get kind of, or you make a joke about Vladimir Putin, and the line is cut. Someone is listening, and I thought for a while it was automated software, and then I realized it wasn't. It's someone sitting with headphones in Greater Moscow, listening to calls like The Life of Others, like during the Cold War, still goes on. And I mean, I won't dwell on this, but essentially, my 4 years in Moscow ended with us being kicked out, with me being deported from the country in 2011. And I think part of the problem was that there was a sort of divergence between what Russian correspondents were writing about, most of them by this point under the thumb of the Kremlin, not all, very good journalists in Russia still, but essentially state, TV and most of the media was under the control of the presidential administration, and what foreign correspondents were writing, which was different. And when I was there, I was pursuing things like the murder of Alexander Litvinenko, about whom I wrote a book, The Dissident Poisoned in 2006 with a Radioactive Cup of Tea, trying to get to the bottom of the Russian state role, what exactly the FSB had done. That's Vladimir Putin's old spy agency, the same people we think who poisoned Alexei Navalny in August in Siberia with Novichok. I was trying to explore kind of top-level Kremlin corruption and answer a very simple question, which is how much money does Vladimir Putin have? And to which the glib answer is he's the richest man in the world. And not because if you go to HSBC in Geneva and ask for a bank account in his name, you will find all this. But because collectively he presides over a kind of team of people whose assets are worth in excess of $500 billion, and he can utilize that money however he wishes. He can use it for private purposes, buy a yacht, build a palace. He can use it for geopolitical purposes to influence an election, or for kind of national prestige projects like hosting a World Cup or the Olympic Games. So he's phenomenally wealthy. And I wrote about the FSB as well, and their activities, including in the North Caucasus, where there's a war going on with Islamists. And all of that, I think principally my Litvinenko research led to me being kicked out of Russia. And essentially, I sort of thought I would stop writing about Russia, but various things happened. I got back to the UK. I became friends with Marina Litvinenko, and I kind of pursued those stories that I've been trying to kind of track from Moscow unsuccessfully. And Moscow being, as anyone who's worked there will know, a place of rumor and disinformation and planted rumor and conspiracy. A conspiracy is almost hardwired into people's thinking, especially the elites who are very KGB and Soviet in their mindset. But the other reason was that essentially my experience helped me understand what was going on in the world. And what was going on in the world is that Russia was taking various tactics that it had sort of perfected at home and going on the road internationally, and was becoming increasingly aggressive and territorialist. So I covered the war in Georgia in 2006 for The Guardian. 2008. I subsequently covered the war in Ukraine, annexation of Crimea and the conflict in the east in Donbass. I was on the front line there for several weeks, reporting out what was going on. And meanwhile, as well as sort of Soviet misadventures or neo-Soviet misadventures in the near abroad, which is how the Kremlin regards sort of neighboring states, the Baltics, Ukraine, Georgia, and so on, that there were also these spectacular international operations. So, okay, this is my boss. I've got to take this. Can you just step in, Miriam?
Absolutely. I'm going to mute you there. Okay, thanks very much, Luke. Well, we talk about the future of journalism, and to have our speaker live in the newsroom. I'm going to unmute you again. Are you okay?
So I think the best thing to do, Mira, is, because I can see that I'm going to get sacked if I don't take this call. I'll take this call. If you can talk for maybe 3 minutes, then I'll continue and we'll do our seminar to the end. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
I'm so sorry. You know,
no problem at all. I think at this, okay, I'm going to mute you. Caitlin, can you unmute yourself? I'm going to draw into the room here to just ask you to kind of respond to a little bit of what the points Luke made at the beginning, which was about basically saying that, it's not about claiming that Russia is a superpower, a kind of all-powerful entity that can manipulate us. But there are tactics they use in the UK, the US, on the global stage, that they learned domestically, crucially. And I think one thing we have noticed always from having Russian journalists on the fellowship program is they all highlight the fact that, a lot of the misinformation campaigns that Russia is active in are aimed at Russians. So they are the first kind of targets, the first victims, if you like, and the most affected. And that's the sphere through which we kind of need to really hold this debate.
Yeah, I think as he was saying that, I was thinking to myself, the results that we've seen for Trump almost quite radically undermine the idea that the Russians were influencing anything at all. Yeah. And I think there's a danger that the media can play into, almost play a role in hyping up this illusion of a puppet master. But does anyone in the room have any thoughts along those lines?
Yeah, the tools which are usually used by Russia.
I'm sorry, I can't hear that very well at all.
you just project.
Okay.
Luke is back, Ramesh, thank you. We'll come back to you in a second. Thank you.
No, guys, I'm really, really sorry. That's totally hilarious. So just, breaking news. So Jamie Wilson, he said, this is the, international editor-in-chief of The Guardian. I've got a major editorial investigative assignment for you. And I'm thinking, oh God, it's like, they want me to write up all of the funny things that happen on election night. So here I am talking about the big picture, the future of journalism, international affairs, and they want like some funny stuff to leaven out all of the.
And this is how the Guardian is getting its 70 million paid.
Well, clearly we're very diverse. Anyway, I do apologise. I would never, with any other audience apart from you guys, I wouldn't do this. But you understand the game. So you're in a room full of working journalists. It's absolutely fine. So we're good for. So I'm nearly wrapped up. But I'll just do 5 more minutes. Then we'll go to questions. Which is just about the kind of international misadventures of Russia. I mean, that's essentially why I keep investigating this stuff and why I keep writing my books, because we've seen these spectacular events, whether it's Litvinenko, whether it's the attempted murder of Sergei Skripal, the Novichok in the spring of 2018, which is the beginning of my new book, Shadow State, or whether it's this spectacular operation in 2016 to help Donald Trump win, which was wildly successful. And which I think made a decisive difference. And what happens at a political level is that Putin does these things, waits for a reaction, and when it doesn't happen, he sort of doubles down and carries on. And thus far, I don't think sort of Western policymakers or governments have got to grips with this. And there is a kind of reluctance verging on sort of ostracism from this government in particular, from the government of Boris Johnson, over the whole question of Russian interference. We had the Russia report finally in August, which said that there had been no attempt by either the government of Theresa May or of Boris Johnson to investigate Russian influence operations in British politics, in particular over Brexit. Now, I've got a whole chapter called Moscow Gold in Shadow State, and it's clear that the Russians were pushing for Brexit because Putin hates the European Union. He thinks it will divide and weaken the UK, possibly bring on Scottish secession. And I sort of I basically do a sort of profile of this guy called Alexander Udod, who was a rather tall young man, who was the chief Russian spy who was meeting with the Brexiteers, introducing them to the Russian ambassador in London and so on. But the government doesn't want to know. The Russia report says this. The spy agencies who British spy agencies you think are kind of omniscient didn't really investigate all this. And the latest is that Johnson is refusing a public inquiry. And more than that, he has ennobled Yevgeny Lebedev, owner of the Evening Standard newspaper, to become a peer. Now, I know Yevgeny's father, Alexander, very well, former KGB officer. And this is kind of quite scandalous, and this is something I've been investigating too. And just on that, the point is that the tenor of my reporting is not to say, that here are bad Russian actors doing bad things, corrupt things far away. It's about turning the spotlight on our societies and looking at how this tide of Russian money is influencing our politics for the worse. Whether it's peers sitting on the boards of Russian companies, whether it's Russian donations to the Conservative Party or so on. And ultimately, it's a question of our corruption. And we've had plenty of proof of that. I mean, those of you, many of you who are listening, probably worked on the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers for your respective sort of newspapers and media outlets. And what we know is, sure, there are kleptocrats in places like Azerbaijan and Russia who steal billions of dollars, but equally there is a network of lawyers, of accountants, of corporate investigators, of private school headmasters who take this money and who kind of work as sort of facilitators. A lot of people in London have got extremely rich PR people as well, so on the edges of our industry, from taking Russian cash. And we saw proof of this in the Panama Papers. I mean, that probably was the most significant investigation I did after Edward Snowden. I wrote a book about him as well, the Snowden Files I did with The Guardian. But the Panama Papers just showed the extent to which kind of corruption these days is global, it's transnational. And the good thing to say is that the model that you guys, all of us have been doing over the last few years, I'd say the last decade of collaboration has really worked. I think when we tried it with there've been collaborations before, but when we tried it with the Panama Papers in summer, autumn 2015, spring of 2016, it felt sort of experimental, where you had 200 journalists all around the world working in secrecy on a common project with common reporting platforms, a high degree of security, coordination from the ICIJ in Washington. And it sort of looked like a really ungainly super tanker trying to get through the Suez Canal. But actually we got through the canal and we kind of published triumphantly. I mean, it was a huge queue. And those groups, I mean, that they vary as to who's in them, but everybody understands that in a time of straitened budgets, where journalists are being laid off, including on my newspaper, there are about 70 journalists the Guardian said they want to get rid of in the next few weeks. Some of my colleagues this week told me that they're taking voluntary redundancy. So there's no money, but the multiplying effect of collaborating is astonishing. We are so much stronger for it. And those networks, I mean, I talk to my colleagues, friends really in Germany, in Italy, in the US all the time. I was talking to someone from La Stampa just yesterday on an investigation that we're doing, which just kind of came about informally. It's not a kind of formal thing, but we have a kind of, I can't talk about it, but we have a kind of common goal. And I'm really thrilled by that. I'm thrilled that when there's lockdown, when there's Zoom, when we're just strolling around our gardens, actually we can be hyper connected. We can still work creatively and collaboratively. And I actually think, despite all of the gloom, despite all of the populism, despite the fact that, if Trump doesn't win, he almost won, and he may yet win, we don't know. Despite all of that, I think this is a golden age for journalism. I think it's a golden age for the Reuters Institute and for media research, media studies. And I think collaboration across frontiers is one of the few good elements of our kind of benighted century.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Luke. Thank you. And thank you for the kind words about the Institute as well. I just want to kind of ask a question following up from what we were talking about, who has agency and the role of journalists in discussing misinformation, disinformation, when we also have a lot of evidence that a lot of the misinformation around COVID has come from the top. It's come from elected officials and politicians spreading false news. And then you also have other misinformation that's spread by bad actors more surreptitiously. What do you think the role of journalists and the media should be here in terms of how we report this, which voices we amplify, what kind of qualifiers we put in? Because our job is to report what's happening in society and report on the debates in society. But when the debates are a bit demented, frankly, what do we do?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, Mira, and also a very apposite one. I mean, just a few hours ago, 2 in the morning Eastern time, Trump declared victory.
Exactly.
In an election, and that looks as if he may lose. And within 5 minutes, Twitter had branded his tweet. Even Facebook, who I mean, Facebook is probably a subject for another seminar, but even Facebook had called this into question. And I think our knowledge has expanded. I still think in the digital world there are tremendous vulnerabilities. I think malign actors, not just Republicans or Russian spies sitting in St. Petersburg, are absolutely able to sort of take advantage of the porousness, the hyper-connectedness of our society in a way that wasn't previously possible. And this also goes to why Vladimir Putin is so clever, because what he's done is take the Soviet playbook, which was all about active measures, about trying to influence the minds, the thinking of hostile capitalists, and bring them over to the Soviet cause. I mean, that generally didn't work very well, at least not in the first world. Developing world, there was more ingress. But now, with these social media operations, it's impossible to have incredible reach. So, Facebook was basically gamed in 2016 by a handful of cynical 20-something, Russians sitting in a kind of sitting in a glass office block in St. Petersburg. So I think we're better at that. I think the New York Times, the Guardian, etc., CNN, I mean, you know, we will use the word falsely. I mean, people will say that Trump lies, etc. We are trying to be kind of empirical and factual. The problem is that in our sort of kind of polycentric mediaverse, if what last night teaches is that half of the American population get their news from Fox or from the Washington Examiner or from the Gateway Pundit or from other sort of far right wing kind of ecospheres, and they live in a different reality. And this is the problem, is that when you're talking about truth in the 21st century, very quickly you come up against relativism, and you come up against the fact that cynical actors like Putin, and indeed Trump, who I think does it intuitively rather than because he sort of studied it, realize that you can use relativism as a weapon, that you can come up with different versions of reality, and it no longer becomes about truth or truthful reporting. It becomes about narrative. You establish your narrative early. You know, I won the election, and millions of people will believe that. And that's alarming in a kind of fractured, fragmented media landscape where the BBC in this country is coming under attack. And so, I mean, I just think we have to keep the faith as journalists. We have to try and write what's accurate. We have to, if we make mistakes, we have to correct. And we have to carry on being truthful in a world where literally everything, any kind of statement appears to be, even over COVID or vaccines, appears to be being contested by some people, whether they're sincerely wrong or whether they're malign.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Luke. I think you're absolutely right. I'm going to take that back to the seminar room and to Caitlin, and to ask you for a response, and also if Rasmus, who might be still there, has something.
Yeah, we've got quite a few questions in the room actually. So if you don't mind, we might just hog some space for a little bit.
Sure, I'll try to get briefer. Sorry, yeah.
I wanted to first say yes, thank you, and I agree so much, Luke, that there is a need to look at all the positives that have come out of this situation and see how we have grown. But there is something that I find quite striking about the narrative of how we have grown, and it's the idea of taking us back to 2016 and that dossier, and how very adamant we were as journalists and as specialists that it's on the level, guys. It's all true. We've got sources. We know, and as we've seen, in recent weeks and months, it's been quite roundly panned now by the intelligence community as a.
That's actually not quite true, but
okay. Well, maybe you can address that for me, because my question is, are we too quick to blame others and blame Russia and blame Fox and blame alternative realities when perhaps we may be guilty of a bit of relativism ourselves? That's my question.
Yeah. Okay. Well, just on the dossier, I mean, I've written 2 books about the dossier, and obviously I know Christopher Steele very well, who wrote it. And I saw him in December 2016 before the dossier was published, and he didn't actually mention it. It's the opening of Collusion. We had a drink in the Shakespeare pub in Victoria because I was trying to investigate Donald Trump and Deutsche Bank. And the thing is, if you look back on 2016, I mean, where were the big journalism mistakes made? I mean, not over the dossier. That's for sure. I think the mistake in 2016 was an overfixation on Hillary Clinton's emails, which were hacked by Russian military intelligence as part of a kind of classic active measure. And the problem with the dossier, which was sort of kind of circulating orally in America, I mean, Chris briefed a few kind of very senior journalists there, was this stuff was impossible to prove and stand up. So no one really went with it. How could you prove that Trump had been videoed in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel by the FSB? I mean, he was, I'm certain of it, because when I was in Moscow, the FSB had video in my bedroom. I mean, they even left a sex manual on one occasion by the side of the bed when we were away, which I then had to explain to my wife, you know, as to what it was doing there. So everybody understands that surveillance happens in Russia, and that also that the dossier is right, that Putin will have an enormous file or archive of compromise on Donald Trump. I mean that much is clear. I mean, was the dossier immaculate and right in every respect? No, it wasn't. It was a raw intelligence product. Was it broadly right about the fact that the Kremlin wanted Trump to win, had been cultivating him substantially, and were engaged in a massive subterranean espionage operation to help him? Yes, it was. So, I mean, I think what you have to understand is that Trump and his kind of Republican allies and supporters have been trying to undermine Chris Steele and the dossier forever, because then the whole suggestion that he's not in some way kind of legitimate, that all falls away if the dossier is fake and a hoax and so on. But actually the dossier, I think, to my mind, is broadly right. And if you think it isn't, you have to then explain why the one consistent theme in Trump's presidency, which I've kind of charted, I don't write about Trump per se, but I write about Trump and Russia, has been Trump's absolute subservience to Putin, his refusal to criticize. And I have a whole chapter, I don't know if any Finns are watching, but about the 2018 summit in Helsinki, which my friends from Helsinki Sanomat helped me with. I mean, I do think that's one of the defining moments of his presidency, be it 4 years or 8 years, is when he's asked whether he sides with Putin or his intelligence agencies, and he picks Putin. I mean, that's astonishing. So be careful about writing off the dossier. The Wall Street Journal don't like it, Donald Trump doesn't like it, but actually, I think the broad arc of Kremlin support for Trump and espionage is right. Why don't we move on, and I can come back to the relativism. Yeah.
Hello, Luke. Thanks for the talk. Good to see you.
Congratulations.
Thank you. In some weird way, I suppose. Just a quick question. I think you called Trump a homegrown monster. Now you might think he's a monster. I might think he's a monster. I couldn't possibly comment. But what do you think the sort of roughly 65, 67 million Americans who voted for him think of that term?
Well, you know, I'm speaking among friends, and I think I probably would, you know, if I were doing this for CNN or BBC, I would probably use a sort of milder noun than monster. I mean, the point wasn't to kind of dismiss the people who sincerely vote for him, even if we might vehemently disagree with them. The point was merely to make clear that, you know, Russia didn't create Donald Trump or grow him in a bottle like a homunculus. That actually he came out of very American kind of conditions, which you can understand. And you know, dozens of books have been written now about the Trump era. I've done two, and it's clear that the sort of strife, the growth of white supremacy, the disillusionment, the anti-establishment feeling, the sense that people have just been sort of stiffed in recent years, that's all real. And Trump, you have to acknowledge, is a communicator of genius. He has managed to channel this inchoate sense of resentment and left behindness and fed upness, and he's done it through sheer force of personality, of stamina, and some really kind of clever political sloganizing, which has worked. It's worked better than the pundit class thought it would do. It's clearly worked again to some degree, even if he does lose. We'll probably know a bit better when we come out where things at. So I'm not writing off his supporters or saying that they're unpeople or unhumans. Of course not. But at the same time, it is astonishing that someone who is, if not a white supremacist, who espouses white supremacist sort of slogans and ideas, and who has been so dysfunctional, and also who's presided over America where 230,000 people have died of the coronavirus, in part because of his mismanagement of it, that he can do so well and be almost re-elected and possibly re-elected. We don't know.
Thanks, Luke.
Rebecca, we're going to have to project
I will project. Hi Luke, it's Rebecca Skipper-Chair. I run the anti-disinformation team at BBC Monitoring. Our Russia analyst at Monitoring, Olga Robinson, who was Russian herself, says that in the 1980s, the Kremlin wanted people to believe that this was the truth. And now they want people to believe that there is no truth. I just wonder what your comments would be on that.
Yeah, I mean, and that's an interesting observation. I mean, I think that's broadly right. Although there's a lot of similarity and overlap between the sort of Putin Russia of the 21st century and the Soviet Russia of the 20th century. I mean, Putin's thinking is very KGB, and I sort of think, I mean that's right, but also there's something kind of quite Leninist in this hyper cynical, there is no truth, it's all about narrative approach. In other words, sort of the Leninist view, if you go back 100 years, was that Soviet truth was superior to bourgeois truth, if you see what I mean. So that the relativism didn't start with Putin. The relativism is actually kind of is deeply embedded in the Soviet system. That you know, bourgeois truth is not a truth, even though it's actually kind of real. But this sort of the way the Kremlin does it now, I mean, it's really interesting. And there's a colleague of mine who, a while back, interviewed Margarita Simonyan, who's the editor-in-chief of Russia Today, who famously, in 2018, interviewed the two Skripal Salisbury assassins, and he asked her, he discussed this with her, and she basically said, you know, there is no truth, there is only narrative, and suggested that anyone who believed that the world or politics was any different was a sort of sucker, that we're kind of naive, that we are losers, that actually in this great cacophonous game, it's the only way to kind of play it. And I don't believe that. I mean, clearly populism is very much with us and is defining and shaping the era. I mean, the Trump vote shows us that. But I think our mission as journalists has got to be to stick with the truth rather than, you know, a multiplicity of truths or narratives. I think we really have to tell it to the best of our abilities, recognizing our imperfections, and stick with that empirical idea, because otherwise I do think we're lost.
Hi. Sorry. Perfect. Hi, my name is Kathy. I'm from Toronto, Canada. And certainly we've had Russian disinformation in our elections as well. But I have a question, not about politics, but about COVID. And I'm wondering if there's been any work done on whether there has been any, you know, Russian bad actors involved in fueling disinformation around COVID. And is there scope for a global collaborative project on the kind of disinformation?
I think that's a really good idea. I mean, I would love to read a thesis or a kind of wonderful Reuters Institute paper in 2021, 2022, when we're all out of this nightmare about it. I mean, I've got no hard data, but my strong suspicion, I'm speaking deductively, knowing how the Russian disinformation machine works, is that absolutely the Kremlin will have been pumping disinformation narratives about COVID and vaccines into kind of Western informational space, particularly in the US, the UK, and so on. I mean, a lot of these people who've been demonstrating against COVID, these anti-mask demonstrations are kind of, they're real people, that they believe this, that it's indigenous, if you like, or organic. We have Nigel Farage, who's been campaigning for Trump, saying that he's going to launch this new party called Reform UK, an anti-lockdown party. He's got pretty good political instincts. He clearly sort of senses a gap there. But this is precisely the kind of thing that Russia will use or try to use, because it divides and weakens society. It creates doubt towards government and established authority, established science. It's all about rival narratives. And in the end, just to carry on from what I was saying before, you know, Russia's not ultimately interested necessarily in their narrative prevailing to try and convince you that Russia is a great country that's virtuous and democratic and peace-loving. That the goal is to bamboozle and to confuse. At a time of kind of heightened global anxiety, this is a very promising vector. I mean, they do secessionism, they do Euroscepticism, anything which is against the establishment is fruitful for these guys. And so I think if and when there is a proper statistical analysis of who's tweeting what, I think you will find a lot of malign, non-organic actors from Russia who are doing this as a way of chipping away at Western societies in the time of crisis.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just jump in here? So there's a question from Anders in the kind of chat room that I think is worth highlighting. It's saying, you talked about narratives and you also talked about collaborative and important investigative journalism, and he does make a very good point. In my view, the US has not been lacking strong in journalistic investigation around Donald Trump, the result of which would have probably sunk any other politician in another time and place. But it seems to have just been drowned out, often within days or hours, by Trump-driven headline storms that move the attention away from the original story, the story of corruption. And do you feel that important journalism is drowned out by colleagues and rivals in other newspapers? So are the most significant stories not grabbing people's attention?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, first of all, I'd just like to kind of acknowledge that there's been some great journalism investigating Trump and others from people in this room, from people in the US, from people everywhere. And he's been a gift. I mean, my Collusion was a #1 New York Times bestseller. I mean, it's a bit, there's an appetite to read this stuff and to report and to illuminate. There's been some great journalism done by New York Times, by the Post, by others. But the problem is that we're in this sort of Snyder-esque place, by which I mean Timothy Snyder, the Yale historian who's written some brilliant books on our current crisis. I mean, he and someone else I like very much is Anne Applebaum. I mean, for anyone who hasn't read it, her Twilight of Democracy is a terrific book, and I don't know if she's speaking in this seminar series, but it's definitely worth getting her along at some point. But the problem is that I mean, the Snyder thesis is that if politics heads off in this kind of performative direction, this sort of Mussolinian direction, it becomes less about sort of sensible choices or pragmatism or vision of the future. It becomes about spectacle. And Trump understands this perfectly, I would say, better than anyone else, but better than any other kind of modern or postmodern political leader, is that he really does spectacle. I mean, maybe it's his grounding in reality TV, but most of the time he doesn't appear to actually be the president. He appears to be playing the role of president. And you just have to sort of see the video of him emerging from hospital after his bout of COVID and arriving off the helicopter and taking his mask off on the lawn. I mean, it's really cheesy. I mean, what a terrible Netflix series, and yet it works. He understands that, and I mean, well, okay, we've been going 50 minutes. I'm not saying Trump is a fascist, but there are fascistic edges to what he does, where it's about spectacle rather than substance. It's about the shining lie rather than the boring truth, and that feels where so much of our politics is, to some degree, including in this country, where you have Boris Johnson, who's to my mind, an enormously overrated and flawed politician, but one who is entertaining. It's as if our kind of desire to be entertained has trumped our need for good governance. And despite everything, that still seems to some large degree to be the case.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks, Anders, for raising that point. Going back into the room, Ramisha, did you have a question?
Hi, this is Ramisha Ali from Pakistan, and I work as a news correspondent for the Urdu service of the Independent UK. My question is that do you think Russia is targeting the West through a divide and rule approach, considering their long-term objectives to weaken the EU and the NATO and to have the sanctions removed?
Yeah, I mean, in brief, I think that's right. These were long-held kind of KGB Politburo objectives to weaken NATO and the European continent. I mean, that's the prime reason why the Russians were, or the Kremlin was all in for Donald Trump, because they thought that was kind of quite promising. And in fact, Trump has really kind of estranged Washington from Berlin and Paris, and to some degree from London, in a way which goes beyond the dreams of the drunkest KGB general. I mean, really transatlantic relations at the lowest they've been for the entire kind of post-war period, and the US is in literal military and you might say also moral retreat. The idea of America sort of shining city on the hill is gone. So we're in a wild and anarchic place, which is to Russia's advantage. I mean, Putin really wants to go back to a sort of 19th century model of global affairs where great powers roll over smaller, weaker powers, where there are spheres of influence. And I think he would like to be absolutely kind of preeminent on the European continent. And to some degree, he's been quite successful, not necessarily through physical conquest this time around, but through subverting the electoral systems of sort of post-communist countries. I mean, we talked about, Russia and Brexit. That's definitely a thing. But if you look at Russian influence in places like Slovakia or the Czech Republic or Hungary or the Western Balkans or Cyprus, which is practically a Russian client state, certainly on financial terms, it's been enormous. And all of this is not to say that Russia is rampant, is a universal actor. But I go back to my earlier point, is that Putin is a classic opportunist who plays a long game and has a real genius at sniffing out the weakness of his opponent. And that's where we are right now.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to the chat room because I think Paddy Coulter has a question and he's definitely earned the right to ask it. And he's asking, what about more journalistic collaborations with script writers? Your collaboration with Lucy Prebble on A Very Expensive Poison was really powerful play. Anything more? Because we've actually, to interrupt, we've been talking about storytelling, and last week we had an excellent speaker who had done a kind of project on what makes effective storytelling, where he'd spoken to puppeteers and theatre directors as well as journalists, and it was very compelling, and it kind of made you want to get rid of the inverted pyramid and tell stories differently.
Yeah. I mean, just from my point about Trump and performatism, if you like. I mean, probably most of you didn't see the play A Very Expensive Poison, which was the old Vic just before the pandemic struck. And was nominated for an Olivier Award for Best New Play, but lost out to some unknown guy called Tom Stoppard. I don't know what happened to him, but anyway. But actually, the genius of Lucy Prebble and the way she adapted my book was that she recognized that there is a kind of show business aspect to all of this. I mean, there's something darkly theatrical about sending assassins all the time from Moscow to London to kill someone in a sleepy provincial city. And her play was sort of vaudevillian. It had singing, it had dancing, it had Vladimir Putin as this kind of rather irritating guy who kept on speaking from the gods, addressing the audience directly and breaking the fourth wall. And it was funny. And I spent a lot of time thinking about how you portray the contemporary Russian state. And in the end, one analogy I came up with, it's like a kind of lethal and shambling golem going down the street, and you think, oh, look, there's a golem, isn't it so dumb? Ha ha ha, stupid golem. And then a golem takes a mighty arm and fist and smashes the roof in of your house. And then it's less funny. And it's this sort of veering between awfulness and kind of farce all the time. So yeah, no, we should collaborate. No one tweet this, but because this hasn't been announced yet, but there is a TV drama being made of my book on Litvinenko and Mafia State. It's going to be a big 8-episode affair where it's kind of my story or our story. I'm called John, apparently. Don't know if any Johns watching rather than Luke, and the timeline is shifted.
There aren't many Johns in Oxford, I swear.
And our kids who are kind of very unruly are going to be like all cutified. Anyway, that's coming. I don't know.
Really?
Yeah.
Who's going to play you?
Not being cast yet. It's going to be cast next year.
I can't wait to see that. Thank you.
So yes, ongoing, and why not?
Absolutely. Caitlin, last question. Is there a last question from the room before we? You're on mute. True.
I'm just checking to see if there is a last question from the room. I could definitely ask one. Gosh, I think perhaps to end on, what are the lessons that we take into the next 4 years? I love this concept of relativism and whether we've been distracted. How do we keep an eye on the ball?
Well, I mean, this is perhaps a kind of underpowered response, but I do think we have to stay cheerful. I think that's quite important. And following on from collaboration, we have to support each other. We have to be nice to each other. We have to acknowledge each other's work, whether it's linking or tweeting or working on investigative kind of projects. I think what will keep us sane in dark times is a sense of solidarity. And actually, Reuters Institute is extremely good at that. I mean, you guys are better than anyone at creating solidarity across international boundaries and bringing people together to do kind of important and timely work. And so I would just say, yeah, all power to you, first of all, but also sort of stay cheerful and try and find ways of escaping this. I found my father this morning at 8 in the morning when all was lost. And I said, Dad, what do we do? It looks like Trump's going to win despite my books, despite our best endeavors. And his answer was poetry. He's been reading a lot of, he's 80 years old, he's been reading a lot of poetry. So, I mean, you want to find kind of one passion which takes you away, whether it's bird watching or poetry or walking or playing football or whatever, what sort of takes you out of it and keeps your kind of mind sane. And otherwise we have to keep questing and asking important questions and trying to interrogate our dark era. I mean, it's awful, but you have to kind of sneakily admit at the same time it is quite exhilarating. I mean, I kind of jump out of bed in the morning full of zing. Actually, I had COVID. That hasn't been true for all of this year, but these days I kind of, jump out of the room with zing. And there are so many kind of despots and bad guys out there. We have plenty to go at. So, stay sane, love your neighbor, and go Reuters Institute. My parting message.
Luke, I can't really top that. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time. So sorry to keep you away from your desk. It's been, I can't believe we asked you to speak today of all days. And I'm absolutely amazed and very, very grateful you did. It's been inspiring, informative, and utterly brilliant and exhilarating. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you.
I will leave you back to file. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.